Hello, dear story lovers. At the amount of 1,000 subscribers, I will post a huge series of special stories for you. Subscribe now. The red warning lights inside the Silver Dawn pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, synchronized with the shrill alarm that blared through the corridors. Dr. Elara Miles, her medical satchel slung over her shoulder, scrambled through the narrow passageways of the transport ship. Outside the porthole windows, the stars were distorted by the looming silhouette of a Marauder fleet cruiser. Evasive maneuvers, the captain shouted from the cockpit, his voice crackling over the intercom. We can't let them board. Elara gripped a nearby rail as the ship veered sharply to the left, her body lurching against the force. She wasn't a soldier. She had no weapons, no training for combat. Her role in the war had always been one of preservation, not destruction. Yet, as the medical transport ship jostled violently under enemy fire, she realized her oath to save lives might now include her own. A booming metallic clang resonated through the hull, signaling the Marauder ship's grappling hooks had found their mark. Elara's heart sank. The Marauders weren't known for mercy, especially toward anyone aligned with the Galactic Union. To them, everyone aboard this vessel was either an enemy or a prize. The hissing sound of melting metal echoed through the corridors. The Marauders were cutting through the hatch. Elara ducked into the medical bay, hiding behind a supply cabinet. She clutched the satchel tighter, its contents of advanced medical equipment and life-saving drugs her only comfort. The hatch burst open with an ear-splitting crash. Through the small gap between the cabinets, she could see them towering figures in black combat armor, their helmets adorned with jagged insignias of their fleet. Their blasters hummed ominously, glowing faintly in the dim emergency lights. Secure the ship, barked the Marauder commander, his voice gravelly and authoritative. Take the crew alive if possible. The rest. He didn't finish the sentence, but Elara didn't need him to. She heard the sharp crack of a stun baton and the muffled cries of the crew being subdued. Elara's breath hitched as heavy boots approached the medical bay. The door slid open with a hiss, and a Marauder soldier entered, scanning the room. She held her breath, curling tighter into her hiding spot. For a moment, she thought they might pass her by. Got something here, the soldier shouted, yanking the cabinet aside. Elara stumbled forward, her hands raised instinctively. Wait. I'm a medic. I'm not armed, she pleaded, her voice trembling. The soldier grabbed her arm roughly, dragging her into the corridor. You think that matters? Medic or not, you're coming with us. Elara was hauled through the ship, past the slumped forms of her unconscious crewmates. Her mind raced, trying to think of anything that might help her escape. But before she could form a plan, she was shoved into a small shuttle docked with the Marauder cruiser. The journey to the Marauders' moon base was a blur of disjointed thoughts and stifling fear. Elara was bound and seated alongside other captives, mostly the ship's crew. The Marauders paid them little mind, too busy celebrating their capture. Upon arrival, Elara and the others were marched through the base, a sprawling facility carved into the rocky terrain of the moon. Its architecture was brutal and industrial, all sharp angles and cold metal, illuminated by flickering red lights. The air was heavy with the smell of fuel and scorched metal. A Marauder guard stopped in front of Elara. This one's different, he sneered, inspecting her closely. Not much of a fighter, are you? I'm a war medic, Elara replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I save lives. The guard laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metallic walls. You'll have plenty of chances to test that claim where you're going. Elara was dragged down a long corridor and deposited in a dark, reinforced cell. As the heavy door slammed shut, she stumbled forward, catching herself against the cold metal floor. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she noticed movement in the far corner. A low growl rumbled through the room. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to see a massive creature, its fur dark and matted, its glowing eyes piercing through the shadows. The thing rose to its full height, its claws scraping against the floor. It resembled a wolf, but its proportions were otherworldly, its muscles rippling beneath its thick coat. "Enjoy your stay," a guard called mockingly through the cell's intercom. "Let's see if the medic can patch herself up after meeting Tharn." The name lingered in the air, heavy and ominous. Elara pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. The creature, now fully illuminated by the faint light, studied her with a predator's gaze. But as the moments stretched on, it didn't attack. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if assessing her. For the first time since her capture, Elara felt a flicker of something unexpected, not fear, but curiosity. Whatever this creature was, it hadn't killed her yet. That was a start. In the stillness of the cell, one thought consumed her: survival. If she was going to make it out of this alive, she would have to figure out who or what Tharn really was. Elara remained pressed against the cold wall of the cell, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. The massive creature across from her, Tharn, the guards had called it, watched her in silence. The only sounds in the room were the faint hum of the ventilation system and the low, rhythmic growl emanating from Tharn's throat. In the faint light, Elara could see more details of her cellmate. The beast was unlike anything she'd encountered in her interstellar travels. It stood on 4 muscular legs, but could shift into a bipedal stance with ease. Its eyes glowed faintly green, a stark contrast to its dark, scarred fur. Jagged, crystalline spines protruded along its back, shimmering faintly as if alive with energy. Every movement Tharn made was deliberate, controlled, and terrifyingly graceful. Elara tried to steady her breathing. If this thing was going to kill her, it would have done so already. That realization gave her a sliver of hope, a thread to cling to in the overwhelming tide of fear. "Okay," she whispered, mostly to herself. "You're not attacking me. That's good. Let's keep it that way." Tharn's ears twitched, and his head tilted slightly at the sound of her voice. It was almost a gesture of curiosity, as if he understood that she was addressing him. Elara swallowed hard. She was a medic, trained to remain calm in the most extreme circumstances. This wasn't the battlefield she was used to, but the principles were the same: observe, adapt, survive. Her gaze swept over Tharn, noting the injuries that marred his massive body. Old scars crisscrossed his hide, and one of his hind legs bore a fresh, raw wound that oozed a dark, viscous fluid. "You're hurt," she murmured, her instincts kicking in. Tharn's glowing eyes narrowed slightly, as though he understood her words, but was deciding whether to tolerate her presence. He shifted his weight, the injured leg barely touching the ground. Elara hesitated. Approaching this creature felt like walking into the jaws of death, but her compulsion to help overrode her fear. Slowly, she reached into her satchel, pulling out a small, compact medical kit. She held it up, showing it to Tharn as if to say, "I'm here to help. Don't eat me." Tharn growled softly but didn't move. Taking that as permission, or at least not an outright rejection, Elara slid forward on her knees, inching closer. The creature's size became even more imposing as she approached. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to focus. "Let's take a look at this," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. She reached out cautiously, her hands trembling as they neared the injured leg. Tharn didn't flinch but kept his gaze locked on her, his growl low but steady. His leg was hot to the touch, the wound pulsating faintly. Elara frowned. The fluid seeping from the injury wasn't blood, at least not any kind she recognized. It was thick and dark, with a faint iridescence. "This isn't good," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "This wound looks infected." She pulled a small vial of antiseptic from her kit and dabbed it onto a piece of sterile gauze. As she pressed it gently against the wound, Tharn let out a sharp growl, his lips curling back to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. Elara froze, her heart pounding in her ears. "Easy," she whispered. "I know it hurts, but this will help. Trust me." To her surprise, Tharn didn't lash out. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, his growl subsiding to a soft rumble. Elara took this as a sign to continue. She worked quickly but carefully, cleaning the wound and wrapping it with a strip of fabric torn from her own sleeve. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would have to do. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold for now." Tharn studied her for a long moment, his eyes gleaming with something that resembled recognition? Gratitude? Elara couldn't be sure, but the tension in the cell seemed to ease. The beast lay down, resting its massive head on its paws, though its eyes never left her. Over the next few days, Elara and Tharn settled into an uneasy coexistence. The guards brought food twice a day, an unappetizing mixture of nutrient paste and water which they unceremoniously shoved through a slot in the door. At first, Elara assumed Tharn would claim it all, but to her surprise, he pushed a portion of the food toward her, a silent gesture of shared survival. In return, Elara continued to tend to his wounds. She discovered that the strange fluid in his veins had properties that defied the laws of biology as she knew them. It seemed to react to her treatments in unpredictable ways, accelerating healing at times and resisting intervention at others. Each day brought new challenges, but Tharn allowed her to work, his trust growing incrementally with every act of care. In the quiet hours of their imprisonment, Elara spoke to Tharn. She didn't know if he could understand her, but talking helped stave off the crushing isolation. She told him about her work as a war medic, her attempts to save lives on both sides of the conflict. She spoke of the patients she had lost, the guilt that weighed heavily on her, and her dreams of a galaxy where people didn't tear each other apart. Tharn never responded, but sometimes, when she paused, he would lift his head and watch her with those glowing eyes. She liked to imagine that he was listening, that he understood more than he let on. One night, as they both lay in the dimly lit cell, the hum of the base's ventilation system was interrupted by a distant explosion. The ground shook, and alarms blared throughout the facility. Tharn rose instantly, his ears swiveling toward the source of the commotion. Elara's heart raced. Something was happening, and whatever it was, it might be their chance to escape. Tharn turned to her, his gaze sharp and focused. For the first time, Elara saw something in his eyes that looked unmistakably like a plan. The base shuddered with the force of the distant explosion, the vibrations rattling the walls of their cell. Alarms blared in harsh, repetitive tones, and red lights flashed ominously, bathing the room in an eerie glow. Elara clutched the edge of the cold, metallic cot, her mind racing. "What's going on?" she whispered aloud, more to herself than to Tharn. Tharn, however, seemed to know exactly what was happening. The massive alien wolf rose to his full height, his glowing green eyes scanning the cell. His crystalline spines, normally dull and motionless, shimmered faintly with energy and twitched as though sensing something beyond the walls. He growled softly, pacing the cell with an almost predatory intent. Elara's heart pounded. This might be the moment she had been waiting for. The chaos of an external attack or sabotage could provide the perfect distraction for an escape. But how? The cell door was reinforced with energy locks, and the guards were heavily armed. She had no weapons, no tools, only her medical kit and the flicker of hope that Tharn might hold the key to their freedom. She knelt near the corner of the cell where the edges of the energy shield met the floor. "If I can just find a way to short-circuit this thing," she muttered, probing the base of the door with her fingers. She needed something conductive, anything that could disrupt the power flow for just a moment. Tharn stopped pacing and turned to her, his sharp gaze locking onto her movements. With a low growl, he padded to her side and nudged her shoulder with his massive snout. She flinched but quickly realized he wasn't being aggressive. "What is it?" she asked, looking up at him. Tharn growled again, this time a deep, rumbling sound that resonated through the room. Then he turned and, with a single swipe of his massive paw, struck the wall near the energy field. Sparks flew as his claws raked against the metal. Elara gasped, realizing what he was trying to do. You're absorbing the energy," she murmured, her eyes widening. Tharn's crystalline spines glowed brighter now, pulsing faintly with the same hue as the energy field on the cell door. He growled again, more insistent this time, and struck the wall a second time. The vibration sent a jolt through Alara's knees. Realizing his intention, Alara scrambled to her feet. Okay. I get it. You're the key. But if we're going to do this, we need a plan. Alara paced the cell, her mind working furiously. First, we need to time this right, she said, thinking aloud. The guards will be distracted by whatever's happening out there. We hit the door when they're changing shifts or responding to the commotion. Second. She hesitated, glancing at Tharn. Once we're out, you'll have to clear the path. You're our best chance against the guards. Tharn growled softly, lowering his head in what Alara interpreted as agreement. The plan was risky, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only chance they had. For hours, they waited in tense silence, listening to the sounds of chaos outside the cell. Shouts echoed through the corridors, followed by the sharp crackle of energy weapons and the heavy thud of explosions. The entire base seemed to be under siege. Finally, the moment came. A pair of guards rushed past their cell, barking orders into their comm units. One of them paused at the door, glancing in at Alara and Tharn. The medic froze, her breath hitching as the guard's eyes lingered on her. Let's hope the beast gets her first, the guard muttered before hurrying after his partner. Alara exhaled shakily. Now, she whispered. Tharn moved with startling speed and precision. He lunged at the energy field, his crystalline spines glowing brilliantly as they absorbed the energy's charge. Sparks flew, and the field flickered. With a deafening snarl, Tharn drove his claws into the base of the door, ripping through the weakened structure. The energy field collapsed with a loud pop, and the door swung open. Alara didn't have time to marvel at their success. She grabbed her satchel and darted into the corridor, staying close behind Tharn as he took the lead. The alien wolf moved like a shadow, silent but lethal. The first guard they encountered barely had time to raise his weapon before Tharn pounced, his powerful jaws clamping down with precision. The second guard managed a single shout before being silenced. Alara tried not to look at the carnage. This wasn't her world, violence wasn't her way, but she couldn't afford hesitation. Survival came first. As they made their way through the base, Alara's heart raced with every step. The facility was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and towering bulkheads, but Tharn navigated it as if he knew the layout by instinct. They avoided major firefights, slipping through side passages and maintenance shafts whenever possible. Finally, they reached the hangar. The massive room was a flurry of activity, with Marauder soldiers scrambling to load weapons onto small ships. Several fighters were already launching into the void, their engines roaring as they ascended into the chaos above. There! Alara hissed, pointing to a small, unguarded shuttle near the far end of the hangar. It wasn't much, but it looked functional and, more importantly, it was accessible. Tharn growled in agreement, leading the way. Alara followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously around the room. They were almost to the shuttle when a shout rang out. Stop them! A group of marauders turned, their weapons trained on the pair. Alara's stomach dropped. There was no cover, no way to avoid the incoming fire. Tharn didn't hesitate. With a thunderous roar, he charged straight at the guards, his crystalline spines crackling with energy. The sight was so terrifying that two of the guards faltered, lowering their weapons in shock. Tharn took full advantage, dispatching them with ruthless efficiency. Alara sprinted for the shuttle, climbing into the cockpit and frantically flipping switches. The controls were alien, but she recognized enough to get the engines roaring to life. Tharn! Let's go, she shouted. The alien wolf bounded onto the shuttle just as Alara engaged the thrusters. The craft lurched forward, narrowly dodging a volley of blaster fire. With a deafening roar, it shot out of the hangar and into the star-filled void. As the Marauder base shrank behind them, Elara let out a shaky laugh, her adrenaline finally subsiding. She turned to Tharn, who was curled in the cargo bay, his spines dimming as he rested. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're free." Tharn opened one glowing eye and huffed softly, as if to say, "For now." The small shuttle rocketed away from the chaos of the Marauder base, its engines humming steadily against the backdrop of the void. Elara gripped the controls tightly, her knuckles white, as she guided the craft toward the neutral zone, a lawless expanse of space where neither the Galactic Union nor the Marauders dared enforce their rules. For now, it was the safest place they could go. Tharn lay in the cargo bay, his immense body curled in a way that seemed impossible for a creature of his size. His spines had dimmed to a faint, steady glow, and his breathing was deep and rhythmic. Elara glanced back at him, marveling at the strange bond they had formed. "You're not so scary when you're asleep," she muttered, allowing herself a small smile. But the smile quickly faded as the weight of their situation settled on her shoulders. The Marauders would likely be hunting them, and the Galactic Union wouldn't be much better. To the Union, Tharn would be a dangerous alien predator, not the intelligent and loyal companion she had come to know. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp chirp of the shuttle's proximity alarm. Elara's heart leapt into her throat as she checked the display. A Marauder scout ship was trailing them, closing the distance fast. "Damn it," she hissed, her fingers flying over the controls. The shuttle wasn't built for combat or speed, but it had one advantage: maneuverability. Elara pushed the craft into a steep dive, weaving through the debris field of a long-forgotten battle. The scout ship fired, a burst of plasma streaking past the shuttle's starboard side. Elara cursed under her breath, her hands trembling as she fought to keep the craft steady. Behind her, Tharn stirred, his glowing eyes snapping open. "Not now, Tharn." Elara shouted as the shuttle shuddered under another near miss. "Unless you know how to pilot a ship, I need you to stay back." But Tharn had other ideas. With surprising agility, he leapt into the cockpit, his massive form barely fitting in the cramped space. He steadied the controls for a moment, his crystalline spines flickering with faint energy. Then, with a growl, he tapped the console with one claw, activating a secondary panel Elara hadn't noticed. "What the how did you know, Dash?" Elara's question was cut off as the panel revealed a targeting system. Tharn let out a low, guttural sound and nudged her arm, urging her to steer toward a dense cluster of debris. Elara hesitated but complied, weaving through the jagged remains of a destroyed battleship. The scout ship followed, its pilot clearly struggling to match her maneuvers. Tharn growled again, pressing a series of buttons on the secondary panel. A pulse of energy erupted from the shuttle's rear thrusters, sending a cloud of debris hurtling toward their pursuer. The scout ship's pilot tried to evade, but it was too late. The craft collided with a massive shard of metal, erupting in a fiery explosion. Elara exhaled a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she eased the shuttle back into open space. "You're full of surprises," she said, glancing at Tharn. The alien wolf huffed softly, his spines dimming as he settled back into the cargo bay. Hours later, they reached the edge of the neutral zone. The stars here were brighter, untainted by the wars that raged elsewhere in the galaxy. Elara guided the shuttle toward a small, rocky planet with a sprawling network of landing pads and trade hubs. This was Haven's End, a known safe harbor for smugglers, traders, and refugees. It was far from ideal, but it would provide the cover they needed to regroup. The shuttle touched down on one of the outer pads. As Elara powered down the engines, Tharn rose and stretched, his glowing eyes scanning their new surroundings. The hum of activity outside was unmistakable, the clatter of machinery, the shouts of traders haggling over prices, and the distant rumble of ships taking off and landing. "We're safe for now," Elara said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. She grabbed her satchel and gestured for Tharn to follow. "Come on. Let's find somewhere to lay low." The pair descended the shuttle's ramp and stepped into the bustling chaos of Haven's End. The air was thick with the smell of oil and ozone, and the crowd was a patchwork of species from across the galaxy. Most gave Tharn a wide berth, their gazes a mixture of fear and curiosity. Elara stayed close to his side, feeling oddly protective. They found refuge in a small, dimly lit cantina tucked away in one of the station's quieter sectors. Elara used the last of her credits to secure a private booth and a plate of unidentifiable but edible food. Tharn sniffed the plate warily before devouring its contents in a single bite. As they sat in the relative quiet, Elara activated the cantina's communication console. She hesitated for a moment before transmitting a broad-frequency message. "This is Dr. Elara Miles, former war medic with the Galactic Union," she began, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I'm broadcasting this message to expose the Marauders' illegal experiments on sentient beings. They captured and tortured an intelligent life form one I've come to know as Tharn. He's not a weapon. He's a survivor. And now we're both fugitives." She paused, glancing at Tharn. His glowing eyes met hers, and she felt a strange sense of reassurance. "If anyone out there is willing to stand with us, we need your help. The Marauders won't stop hunting us, but we won't stop fighting. For justice, for peace, and for the freedom of all beings in this galaxy." She ended the transmission and leaned back in her seat, the weight of her actions settling over her. Tharn let out a low, rumbling growl, resting his massive head on the table. Elara smiled faintly and reached out to touch his fur. "We're not alone anymore," she said softly. "Not as long as we have each other." Outside the cantina, the galaxy continued to spin in chaos. But for the first time in a long time, Elara felt a glimmer of hope. Together, she and Tharn were no longer just a medic and a beast, they were a force to be reckoned with, united by a shared purpose and an unbreakable bond.